al punto que Haití tuvo que pagar a Francia ese derecho a ser reconocido como república independiente. Eso lo hemos conversado en otros.
7.
Reparaciones.
For reparations. This is something incredible, the cynicism of this. Haiti paid for repairs to France due to the damage that they produced to France for having got the independence. Today, the United Nations is approving that military intervention, and there have been other military interventions, and all of them, without exception, have had negative impacts on the Haitian population. This resolution intends to be more careful in it. They don't allow this, they don't allow that, but we know that it is not positive. And we express our permanence thinking about the solidarity to that sisterly nation. They are people who had the initiative for the struggle of the rest of Latin America. Not only the initiative with ideas and projects, but initiative with weapons, with people. It was a project, a political project. And we have a real huge debt with Haiti due to that. So welcome you all for us to continue with our seminar throughout the week. And I will leave you now with Isamar Ochoa from the Center for Social Transformation Studies for her to continue with the presentation. Thank you, Guillermo. Rebeca, welcome once again on behalf of the Center of Studies of Social Transformation and the Simón Bolívar Institute for the Peace and Solidarity of the Peoples. In order to begin this closing session of the third International Seminar on Reparations for Slavery and Colonization. We have been sharing since August, initially with Amsart Bukhari from Benin, then we had Sandy Ujira from Suriname in September. And during all this week, we are going to have a Rebeca Igreja here from Brazil. Rebeca is an anthropologist, a professor of the Department of Latin American Studies of the Institute of Social Sciences and at the graduate program of the Law School of the University of Brasilia. She is a member of the International Superior Council of the Latin American Faculty of Social Sciences, FLACSO. She's a founding researcher of the Latin American College of World Studies and associate researcher of the Centre d'Etudes des Mouvements Sociaux from France. Her research and work focuses on the discussion of access to justice and judicial reforms, human rights, anti-discrimination law, collective rights in the field of public policy, global inequalities, and affirmative actions, as well as the pluriculturalism. And during this week, we are going to be discussing with Rebecca about several subjects that have to do with the African descendant peoples in Latin America, the new theoretical framework regarding the race, the multiculturalist policies and the racial equality, the debate on the affirmative actions in Brazil. And by this, we begin this first session of the week in order to close this third seminar. We remind all of you once again to keep your cell phones off. Likewise, like in all the previous meetings, we had a live transmission through YouTube, reparations and decolonization with simultaneous interpretation into Spanish, English, and French. Without further ado, we give the floor to Rebecca so that she can begin with today's session. Welcome you all to this space once again. Thank you very much for your invitation. It is a pleasure for me to be here with you today. And I will start by saying that I am sorry if I make mistakes with Spanish. I might use other words because I'm used to the Mexican Spanish. But I would like to say is that it's a pleasure for me to be here in a seminar where I had participated online. For me, being present here in person is incredible. Particularly, I would like to thank Guillermo, Jimena, who have become great friends during the last few years. Even though I have just met Guillermo personally now, and I would like to congratulate the organization of this seminar. But since we're going to meet ourselves several times this week, I would like to do this in a very informal manner. I would like this to be a conversation that we could have jointly because I'm interested in knowing the opinion that you have. I would like to know how you live all these situations instead of just talking about Brazil. So, in spite of the moment, I would like to have this in an informal manner. I would like you to feel free to interrupt me, to talk as I speak. I made an organization, a schematic organization. It is very complicated to talk about Brazil without talking a little bit about the history of Brazil because there is a specificity that is related to other countries of Latin America, of the Spanish colonization. And this history marks the distancing that we have from the continent and the effort that we do all the time to have dialogues about what is happening with the rest of Latin America. And when we talk about African American, this becomes even more difficult because, in general, in Brazil, due to the specificity, due to the history of slavery, we talk a lot about comparison studies with the United States. There are lots of exchanges with the United States, an exchange that has not been easy. It has had many oppositions, lots of fights between the Brazilian intellectuals and the US intellectuals. However, there's also a constant sharing of information between the US and Brazil. And this has been a very strong effort from our part, who work with Latin America, to know to extend our gaze towards other situations and experiences of Latin America. Because I believe that even though with the specificity, we have lots of things in common, especially the whole colonization process that we have lived. That is why very recently in Brazil, there has been an interest on the African descendant topic in other countries of Latin America. This is something that is quite recent. And it is just the beginning. It has to do with Colombia, more similarities with Colombia. But regarding about Venezuela, we know very little. What is happening with this topic in Venezuela? So this has been a very strong effort to get in close to other realities of the country. And in fact, since I consider myself a Latin Americanist because I have lived for many years in Mexico, I did many researches in Mexico and Central America. Unfortunately, this is just the first time that I come to Venezuela, and I am very happy about it. But for me, it has been fundamental to have this dialogue with Latin America. So I would like to clarify this a little bit and why, for me, this interest of doing something that can be a dialogue and for me to be able to transmit to you the difference in the context and that together we can discover the similarities as well. How can we have a dialogue between our experiences? I don't know how much time I have available. Can you please tell me? Yeah, I forgot about the interpretation. I have to speak a little slower. Is it okay? Far from the microphone is better? Should I lower the microphone? If I get close to the microphone is better? Okay, well, I have just found the precise posture. Well, so I would like to begin with the historical context because the seminar necessary for the whole contemporary situation that we are living right now has to do with the rights of the Black peoples, and we have to make this historical recovery. How can I show the slides? Well, so I made that division of the contextualization, and I would like to talk about the multiculturalism. Later on, I will explain to you why you and the other countries of Latin America have managed the multicultural shift in Latin America and how we, not only from an academic and theoretical point of view, but from a political point of view, we have tried them to as racial equality and affirmative reactions. The multiculturalism is a political and theoretical proposal, but it hasn't been accepted in Brazil. And that is one of the most important differences to understand because it is within this framework where we locate the political proposals and the political decisions that have been made in Brazil and not in the field of multiculturalism. I would also like to talk about the racial classifications, the self-declaration verifications commissions. I'm going to explain to you what this is about, which has to do a lot with the strong discussion about the censuses, racial ethnical censuses, how we collect information about ethnicity and race of the people in Latin America and in Brazil specifically. Taking into account that in Brazil, we make racial ethnical census since the 19th century. This has been a political custom in Brazil to have demographic census based on race and ethnicity. This is one of the countries that collect this type of information. Then I would like to show you what we call the evaluation of the racial quota policies in Brazil, which are going to exist now for 10 years, and the bureaucracy, the public bureaucracy, how the public administration can absorb these policies, anti-racist policies within the public bureaucracy. So this is what I'm doing right now, what I'm working on right now. And this is very important. And it is a pleasure for me to be in this space because I believe that it's very important to talk about what we do from the point of view of discussion in the academia and what we propose, what we dialogue, and the technical world, in the world of political bureaucracy and in the private management. There are several laws, anti-discrimination laws in this moment, and the relationship between Afro-descendants, but also based on genders, which implies a series of protocols that the companies, private companies, must follow to guarantee the non-discrimination. This is what we're working on in Brazil, how to extend these policies to the private sector of the economy. So this is what we're working on at present times in Brazil. In a very quick manner, and I don't have much information about Venezuela. This has to do with the regional identifications. It's not well written there of the population. Something that is very complex sometimes when we make a presentation or when we write an article in Spanish, how to translate the appointments how to name these people. And you are going to see that in Brazil, we have a very special classification. For example, how we define the Black people, not necessarily Black peoples. We use African descendants, but that is not used for the rest of Latin America. We don't use Afro-Brazilians, and I will explain to you why. And the Black category, which used to be a pejorative category, after the 70s has become the category that is used in a political manner by the social movements. And it is a category that was politically built as the summation of two other color categories, the pretos and the pardos. The two of them together add up and are equivalent to the Black category. I will explain to you why this is different, but this is how we analyze half of the Brazilian population, which is Black. And this has been a vindication of the Black movement for years, and it has been consolidated in the public policies.
Que alguns países latino-americanos utilizam para classificar
regarding the differences that Latin American countries for the classification, I know, for example, in Mexico, they say Afro-Mexican, Black peoples.
The idea was that the blood was what marked being Black or white. And in Brazil, the category of the misogyny was very important, especially with the racist theories. And this had a very poor mark among the Brazilian population. How this discussion happened in the Congress? Italian people came, German people came. The Italian people were very poor. They were fleeing Europe at a times of war, of hunger, and they came to Brazil. And they were given lands mainly in the south of Brazil, which is a colder area. They were provided with land, and that's where they settled. But there was one important condition for that. They had to mix themselves because then the preto would not work. It was not to create ghettos or isolated communities. It wasn't the same organization that the US had. The US, as an axis, had the people, the US people, they had the English speaking people, and the Irish and the rest started to annex themselves. I forgot the Mexicans. That was the worst. They did not what to do with the Mexicans that had invaded. But in Brazil, it was the contrary. Only the immigrants serve. They got mixed with the Blacks, with the indigenous people, and with the other people who were present in the country. And they built the idea of the Brazilian people, of the Brazilian culture. And it is very funny because immigrants could not talk in their own language. It was forbidden. They could not teach their language. It was a project of forced assimilation of these migrants that came from Europe. To the point that the German migration, which was very large, from Sao Paulo to the southern of Brazil, since the German people did not comply with this project of misogyny, there were various discussions in the National Congress to try to accept other types of migrants from Brazil. And then something interesting happened because we had the people from Syria and Lebanon who were not white. For Europe, they're not white. But they made a reinterpretation, and the people from Syria and Lebanon came to Brazil, the Christians too, and they entered into this project of whitening of the population. There was a large debate on Asian people. The Chinese acceptance was forbidden.
Eram na população que era escravizada.
Especially the coolies, which were a enslaved population in different areas of the world. They disappeared. And then black slavery was the only one remaining. And there was a negotiation in the National Congress for the entrance of the Japanese. They didn't want the Japanese, but they ultimately accepted them. Brazil has the largest population of Syrian Lebanese people and one of the largest colonies of Japanese, along with Peru in the world. And there were also people from Russia, Croatia, that were installing themselves in the south. And this was a state policy that was so firm that it will consolidate with the project of racial democracy in Brazil. Brazil's concern was to build our own people, and they were fearing the Asian revolution because they had such a big population of black people. And what had happened in Haiti could have a strong impact in Brazil with the expansion of the black population. So it was necessary to find a way to build these people and to have this black population felt a part of the Brazilian nation. And this is where the Gilberto Freire studies came about. He had studied in the United States with a culturalist, and what he said is that miscegenation wasn't a negative thing for Brazil, but the best project you could have as a racial one, because miscegenation joined the best aspect of all races, and they would add up in order to create a superior race. So there was a series of intellectuals that will then defend what was called the tale of the three races, which is the encounter of the three races when creating a superior people. And Gilberto Freire, when comparing slavery with what happened in the United States and other countries, he made a great research. His books, there was Casa Grande, which was a place in which they were enslaved. So that big house, Casa Grande, was a place in which they had domestic slaves. So there was a relation between domestic slaves and slavers, and they had a very close relation, which caused a more harmonic relation between white and black people. In Brazil, there were also interracial weddings, and he has been criticized because he didn't consider the issue of slavery in the plantations, what was happening to the black population in plantation, and he focuses on the relation of that big house, that Casa Grande, and eliminates the violent space and the violent actions that happened in this context. However, he has never used the term racial democracy, but from his perspective, the idea that Brazil had a racial democracy was born with no racism. If there were differences between white and black people, was because of social classes, but not because of racism. because there was a very close intimacy between white and black people in Brazil. I already talked about the policies of whitening, but it started in 1930. I don't know if you have heard about Getulio Vargas. He was in office twice, first as an elected president and then in a dictatorship. He was a very important figure in building the Brazilian state. People say that Lula is the heir of Getulio Vargas because he designed all the workers' rights and laws in Brazil. He also had a project. It was contradictory because he supported whitening policies, but he also protected the labor market from immigrants. So he created a quota for the Brazilian population and the majority of that for the black population. So it was an integration between the labor market and the black members of the proletariat. So in this process of building national identity in Brazil, he created a very interesting project, which was for cultural assimilation. What was black culture would become the Brazilian culture. This included food, music, everything would become the Brazilian culture, which then becomes how Brazil will feed from the different elements of different cultures to then build the Brazilian culture. There's no Italian, Black, or African culture. There's just Brazilian culture in which all of these elements are incorporated as a national culture. So Black music becomes Brazilian music, art, everything. They assume this idea of miscegenation as a Brazilian element. And with Getulio Vargas, this is one of the first Black parties were created in Latin America, which was the Black Front, the Brazilian Black Front, or Frente Negro Brasileño. This political party eventually disappeared because all political parties were prohibited during the dictatorship. But this period was so contradictory because we were also talking about a fascist time in Brazil. Brazil had a close relation with Germany and with Italian fascism, and we are now reviewing what happened with Bolsonaro and evaluating all of that fascist period in Brazil. And there was also a movement called the Movimento Integralista or Integralist movement, which was fascist, with that idea of the Brazilian people. It was a very strong movement based on miscegenation and was fundamental for this project of Brazilian culture. Many people, even the youth here in Brazil, when we talk about Afro-Brazilian religion, there are two types of religion.
Y decimos que la Umbanda es un producto también de esta
And we
época.
say that it is a product from this time
Pero porque la Umbanda ella
because
es la cara de lo que sería este movimiento.
Umbanda would be the face of this movement.
El candomblé.
We have the elements of the Afro religion, we have the Catholic Christian culture, the religious elements from the indigenous peoples, along with the elements of spiritual from French spirituals that were very strong and firm. And this creates the idea of the force that this movement
Democracia racial.
based on the myth of racial democracy and all of this miscegenation, and at the same time all the projects of population whitening that were still ongoing in Brazil. So that's why I also included the de-Africanization in Brazil and the construction of a citizenship, a Brazilian citizenship in all senses. And the debate of racial democracy and social class. So we focus, what we have to ask ourselves, what are we going to focus on? Social class or the debate on racism, structural racism, which is fundamented on the Brazilian society. Next slide. In 1944, a cultural movement emerged, which was called Black Experimental Theater, or TEN, which was made by important leaders, Black leaders. Different intellectuals also participated. You probably know some of them, like Abby Diaz. I'm sorry, I'm going to talk a little bit slower. So with the different political instances, this experimental Black theater took into account valuing all the contributions of Black and African population for building the country, the Black culture and the African past against Eurocentrism, the proposals of affirmative actions for the Constituent Assembly. Again, we're talking about the 40s. And they're going to organize the first Black Brazilian Congress for discussing the presence of Black population in the country. Next slide, please. So here we have two intellectuals. You're probably not going to read all of these, but the first one is Guerreiro Ramos. He was one of the first ones that promoted whitening and epistemicide. He made a very strong critique to the academia, and he claimed that the Brazilian academy was European, was Eurocentric. They didn't use what was called Eurocentrism today, but he's already making a critique to the academy and the Brazilian academic intellectuals that are not expressed from the plurality of the country from the racial point of view. And he was going to create this concept called sociological reduction. It is a method designed to enable the scholar to practice the transposition of knowledge and experience from one's perspective to another. What inspires it is the systematic awareness that there is a Brazilian perspective. Each national culture has a particular perspective. This is why sociological reduction is only a restricted modality of general attitude that any culture in the process of foundation must assume. And after Ramos, I can share this presentation afterward. I don't know if we would like to finish here to then have questions, because then we are going to start talking about the 70s that starts a new movement for Black history in Brazil. Would you like to ask any questions before I continue?
Más que preguntas, sino que su intervención ha despertado muchos.
Your presentation has highlighted many moments in our lives regarding these elements.
¿Ya? Okay. Dije que más que
What I was
preguntas,
saying was that instead of making a question, I would like to make a comment. Listening to what you had said, you have awakened some curiosities in our lives, not because I am a Black person. I am 70 years old, and we have deepened in these elements that you have described. We have learned that racism, discrimination, and colonization go hand in hand. But there's a lack of a discourse that can consolidate and legitimize this phenomenon. You mentioned some of the writers, the philosophers, that sometimes you are ashamed of reading. Arthur de Gobineau is one of them. You must be very brave to study their content, his content. But this not only happens in Brazil, here in Venezuela, being more open, we also have this kind of phenomena. That's why sometimes we talk about an attitude of making discrimination invisible and racism. So what do we need? We made some contributions in our studies because we needed to find the origin, the beginning of this phenomena here in Venezuela. Fortunately, we've had Venezuelan writers like Ludovico Silva that have favored this, but other intellectuals, we've also had other intellectuals like Alberto Adriani. So we have lived these two contradictory moments. So what do we do to give the next generation a true equal world? And that's the objective of these activities. So this is just a reflection that comes from what I have lived.
Good morning. Regarding the description that you have made about the Umbanda, I would like to ask you about other cases of religious organizations that have incorporated elements of spirituality, of the African life and the sexual diversity as political. And the second question is your opinion about the incidence of the evangelical church in this exercise of the policy and the spirituality, because recently there have been several situations between African descent peoples and African people where that spiritual content is used to satanize the political situation, like it's the case of Haiti in this case, where there are Afro spiritualities, but we can also observe it in Africa with the satanization of the religious agrupations of the Islam. And this reflection has to do with the ecumenism that we see and that is led by the Western centers, but that tries to null or the expressions of the African matrices. Thank you. There are two other questions that we are getting in the chat box of the Zoom connection. Two more virtual questions. One of them is made by Mariela Carrasquero. How valid is that academic discrimination that you were talking about? And the second was made by Jolimar Hernandez. Which were the results of the studies about the brains of the blacks and the whites? About the studies of the brains of the blacks and the whites populations. Good morning. I would like to make a comment because there's something that caught my attention, and that is the contrast that you developed during your presentation when you talked about the history of slavery in the United States and the history of Brazil. Thinking about some continuity and some matters that are common, mainly at the beginning of the 20th century, because we are in a scenario where, besides the punctual relationship that there could be with Germany and Italy, in the Brazilian case or in the Argentinian case, or even in our case here in Venezuela, there's a subject that has to do with the sense of the era and the time that we were living in the modern world, in the geoculture of the modern world at the beginning of the 20th century. It was a geoculture that was basically fascists, thinking about the links of the Rockefeller Center with the German Nazism and the fascism. So it was not a particular case of Brazil or a particular thing of having relationships with some particular countries. It was a moment of the capitalist moment of the development of modernity, where they were rethinking about the construction of the national states with certain distance, because we have a United States that had been independent for 1 century with respect to Brazil, for example, or with respect to Venezuela that had been independent for 1 century as well. And we can check the migrant policies that start to appear in the world in this era. Maybe in the past there wasn't any kind of migrating policy, but in the global north also, there are migration policies that was like the fashion at that time. And in that sense, there is like going back to that expression. We see that in Europe, how they are worried about the control of migration and the discourse that there are regarding the migration that is allowed or not in Europe, depending on the economic interest, like in the case of Spain regarding social security. But we see in the Scandinavian countries where they are denouncing the multiculturalism from Sweden, for example, as one way to justify the problems that the societies of Scandinavia live, besides the theoretical problem that we might have with the multiculturalism. But besides my comment, I have another topic that is more like a question, and that has to do with what you were mentioning regarding the assimilation of the labor force as a result of the abolition of slavery. It calls my attention the contrast that there is with respect to the explicit policy of the Union to integrate the proletariat. Even though it's a segregationist state, there was a policy for integrating the proletariat, because what the landowners denounced was that the populations that had been awarded freedom as a result of the abolition of slavery were not going to proselytize by themselves. And in the case of the United States, they did not think about migration as a substitution of that labor. But how could they do to force the free populations to assume slavery or the waged work, and how they used even financial mechanisms that when you analyze them with respect to what happened with the crisis of 2008, it wasn't too different from the mechanism that were used for the household crisis that then had problems. So I would like you to talk more about that contrast between the methods that were used in the United States to force the population to work by receiving a salary in comparison to the experience of Brazil, which, based on what you said, and I did know about that, that the path was the other way around for the Black peoples. Let's see. Well, I will try to make a combination here of a few topics. I forgot a few of the comments, but it is very interesting what you are saying, because in fact, when we talk about racism, why is the history so important to know where we are headed for? These are state projects that are being built from countries that are designing with lots of discussion, and always see all the things that we see had to do with the fight to integrate to the idea of the people, and that is very, very important. Mainly today, we have B. Diaz, we have Guerrero Ramos. These Black intellectuals would fight not to mark a difference. On the contrary, they wanted to go into this citizenship construction in an equalitarian manner. And Guerrero and those intellectuals who worked with that, what they were searching for was to civilize this poor population, for it to be prepared and to enter the labor market and to enter this new area. So there was a discourse of development, of civilization, of modernization, how Brazil could move in a modern society. Even for the Black intellectuality of the Black movement, the idea was to educate, to train them so that that population that was in the periphery could have access to this modernization of the nation project in Brazil. They were disputing this space in this national construction. And I believe this is important because in racism, for its functioning mechanism to work, it is very important to see how the national ethos is built, how the myth of the nation is built. Because if it's an excluding myth, then it's going to be the driving force of the constant reproduction of this racism, or the consolidation of a space for this population as a reserved space, an exploration space for this population. When I talked about the tale of the three races, about the cohabitation between the black and the whites of Brazil, a peaceful cohabitation, yes, at the beach, the whites and the blacks played together, drank together. There were interracial marriages, but there was a code that was broken in the last governments and that could have not been broken. And that was that we cohabitate, we play together, but on our own places. At the moment when the Black people started to invade the elite spaces, then the game ended. And that is what we saw with the government of Bolsonaro. The Black people stopped recognizing their space. The workers, the poor people, they stopped recognizing their space. And that is very important. This explains what we are currently living in Brazil. I think that we're living a fundamental debate on the state, on the nation that we want, a rupture of this project. In the 70s, that we're going to study in a few minutes, when in the 70s, the Unified Black Movement raised their voices to say that the racial democracy was a fake, was a large lie, this had a strong impact. We lived for 40 years based on democracy, but it was a myth. It was a myth based on a lie. And we have to unmask this myth to be able to reposition the Black population in this country. Because as a national myth, you know that the myths have a strong weight on the nation. Those are teachings in the schools. So this is very important. And when you mentioned about Nazism, etc., when I said that we are revisiting this history, the Brazilian elites from the time of the war, Brazil was very close to those fascist projects. And we're going to talk about the current times, but I was talking with Guillermo that only today in Brazil, especially in Santa Catarina, in the southern state, we've already detected more than 300 neo-Nazi cells in the country. It has become a problem. The neo-Nazis have become a problem in Brazil. And this is very important because Brazil never had a history with the military dictatorship because there was a process of amnesty in the country. That same process, we didn't have the same process that there was in Chile or in Argentina. The militaries didn't render accounts. And we never treated the integralist and fascist movement in Brazil because at the end of the day, there was something that was romantic around the integralist, which was this idea of the Brazilian culture, this incorporation of the Black culture and the Brazilian culture. Some Black leaders were integralists. So a study about the integralists in Brazil connected with this revenge that we see in Brazil today is super important. Regarding the spirituality in Brazil, that is another subject that we're going to study further on. You know that this has become a problem with the evangelical people and how near they are with the extreme right in Brazil. But Brazil was a country that was essentially Catholic. up until 20 years ago. 90% of the population was Catholic. And at the same time, today, people are Catholic. My religion is Catholic, but I usually go the Afro churches. People have more than one religion, or people change religions. People in Brazil used to change religions suddenly from one moment to another. The Islam disappeared. And that history of the Black Islamic people and Muslims who were in Brazil that did the War of Malice is a history that was not well told. This is something that we are recovering right now. However, Brazil was a Catholic country. The most Catholic nation in the world was Brazil, and people used to go to other churches. With the entry of the evangelical people, this dynamic in Brazil changed enormously. First, because the neo-Pentecostal church emerged in Bahia and in Salvador, directly attacking the candomblé. There was a policy for attracting people who frequented the candomblé for the neo-Pentecostal churches. And they even took ownership of some rituals of the candomblé. But these rituals were seen as something that was common for the religion. They were considered demoniac. And this created a phenomenon that was very complex in Brazil, because nowadays, the large proportion of the people who go to evangelical churches are people from the periphery, and most of them are Black people who go to the evangelical churches. And the Afro cults that still have the mothers and the fathers of Black saints, most of the people who frequent those churches are white. So this is something that is quite complicated, because the Black people from the periphery are becoming more evangelical, and there is no possibility, and I'm not talking well about the Catholic Church, because the Catholic Church represented the dictatorship and the extreme right in Brazil. But there's no possibility of being evangelical and going to the neo-Pentecostal evangelical church and to go to a church of the candomblé. That's impossible. And they inaugurated something that had improved with Getúlio Vargas. They went to the terrains of the candomblé and they attacked the people. People died. They destroyed the temples. And this has become very complicated. And I wouldn't like to talk about this now, but today in the favelas that we were talking about before, in the favelas we have, how do we call this? I won't remember the name, but it's like the drug dealing people with Christ. They watch the favelas so that people cannot come out, so that people cannot own their land. So together with the militias and with the organized crime in the favelas, the neo-Pentecostal people unified them. And this has created a very strong perception to the Afro-Brazilian cults. This was at the end of the 19th century, when the capoeira was prohibited, when the cults were prohibited at the beginning of the 20th century. Then we have the Getúlio Vargas era, where this perception decreased, and when they wanted to fight for the resistance of the enslaved, and then they had some type of a dance and a cultural thing. So there was a whole process. There was a lot of discrimination for the autonomies of these Afro cults. And today we see the contrary in Brazil. The religious intolerance in Brazil has become a severe problem with the growth of the evangelical churches, especially because evangelical people constitute what we call in Portuguese bancada. It's like a group, a very strong group in the Brazilian parliament. There are three groups that control the National Congress in Brazil: the evangelical people, what we call the bancada, which are constituted by people from different parties, which is the religious bancada, the defenders or the producers of weapons, which is the bancadas of the chavalas, what we called, and the bancada of the agribusiness. These three groups practically control the National Congress, the political force that we have in Brazil. So we are living a situation that is really very, very complex in Brazil, and it is not possible. And that is a criticism that I do. It's very difficult to talk about racism and Black population without discussing about all these topics, because we're talking about a population that today represents half of the Brazilian population. This without mentioning that the most important question to make is not who are the Black people, but who are the white people? That's the question. Because actually, if we go along with what the United States call white people, then we don't have white people. There is a problem of the people that is defined as white. Even what Bolsonaro said, and you look at that people and you say, are you sure you're white? So what is this whitening? How is it defined? What are the values that it has? This is very important. And there are lots of studies that have focused on this construction, not of the Black people in Brazil, but of the Black people in Brazil.
Como se foi constituindo esta ideia de blanco.
The way this idea of regarding the studies that were done in Europe, they weren't actually determining anything because they just wanted to link the human behavior with morphological definitions and structural definitions of the brain. So these were just empty claims that over time were discredited. However, this idea of evolution that was a characteristic of more advanced societies continues to be thought in some cases when talking about civilization. And please let me make a note here. But we must understand what colonization and racism were regarding invading the American continent. And then after, in the 19th century, with the colonization of Africa and Asia, and the advancement of scientific theories. This is important because if we remember when colonizers arrived in America, I think it was the 16th century, in the years 1500. But back then, the flag of colonization was Christianism, bringing Jesus Christ to the American continent. The church were the ones that established if the Black people and the indigenous people, whether they had a soul or not. And religion is the base of our colonization. But then colonization in the 19th century are part of a scientific project of modernization and racial hierarchy. within the idea of evolution. So this is a transition that has a very strong impact because it puts race as a protagonic role when building nation states. And when we define people, we use race using their heritage. And when we talk about the process of multiculturalism in Europe, and I would like to talk about this afterward, because we are going to talk about this in more detail. But I think that what we're currently living is a new phase from this phase of the 20th century of building a national project, what Emmanuel Wallerstein calls the crisis of the nation state in the world. Because the concept of nation state as we know it today does not longer work for the management of conflicts and how they exist in nations. So if we continue to finish today's session, next slide, please. We have the studies of UNESCO. Brazil has always been one of the best and worst examples of the racial topic in the world. When the war ended, UNESCO created a commission to study in Brazil what was happening, because Brazil was the example of harmony between races. So UNESCO wanted to know how Brazil was fostering this harmony to see if they could replicate that model in other countries of the world. So from the hell Brazil was in the times of miscegenation, Brazil turned into a paradise for race. So UNESCO created a project in the 70s. They sent intellectuals to Brazil and worked along with Brazilian scholars to study the racial relations in Brazil. And that's where the discussion about racial relations emerged, and how white and black people could live in a harmonic way. These studies from UNESCO were very interesting because they had two main schools. First, a group of scholars from Sao Paulo, from the University of Sao Paulo, with Floresta Fernandez and intellectuals from Rio. And there was also a group of scholars who went to the northeast region, where Gilberto Freire did his theories, and these two groups reached different conclusions related to the different regional and historical contexts. The ones that did their study in the Northeast, which is a very poor area with a rural area with a great indigenous influence. This is especially in Bahia, which is a state with a high Black population. But once you go moving from Bahia to the north, you are going to see a higher concentration of indigenous people. So the studies done in the Northeast, they realized there was a more harmonic relation between whites and Black, and racism was not present in the structure of life between white and Black population. But the studies done in Sao Paulo had the opposite conclusion. There is racism. There's a lot of racism in Brazil. But what Floresta Fernandez was saying is that there were a racial prejudice because this myth of racial democracy and this situation of racism in Brazil was a result of the ill integration of enslaved people after the abolition of slavery. So you must think that along with development, industrialization, the intention was to reduce this racism. In the 70s, we must also say we were living a dictatorship, a military dictatorship. I think it ended in 1985, I think, if I'm not wrong. So it was a military dictatorship that lasted for several years. There were no political freedoms in the country. And the perspective from the southeast of Brazil was very different. Sao Paulo is a region with a lot of immigration, with more white people. It has a higher level of industrial development. So it had a very different characteristic when compared to the Northeast. The Northeast was the focus of colonization, of they had a different way of colonizers had a different way of treating people with a system of protection called in is a system that in Brazil works by forcing people to vote the same way colonels want to. I don't know how you call them here in Venezuela. In Mexico, they are caciques. Well, here they are the landowners or the landlords. When we talk about Bahia, in contrast, there was an influence of Afro cultures and Afro religion. It was stronger than in the Northeast, but studies of UNESCO were the first ones that determined, yes, there's racism in Brazil. This isn't a model for the world for ending racism. And this is another important debate in Brazil because back then the country was living a massive rural exodus because the Northeast had one of the biggest droughts in history, and people were dying life conditions were miserable, the lack of access to drinking water, there was no food security, infant mortality. So the situation there was the worst you can imagine in the Northeast. And during this year, a massive amount of people from the Northeast start moving to Sao Paulo. Lula was part of this exodus along with his family, and this starts generating discrimination toward people from the Northeast, not only because they were black people, but because they were very short, they were not properly nourished, and they had a different accent. They talked in a different way. So they start to be seen as traditional, without culture, retarded. So they start settling in the favelas of the city of Sao Paulo. There was a difference between black people from the Northeast and the black people from Sao Paulo, which were living in the same favelas. They were suffering. The black people from Sao Paulo were suffering from discrimination, but they were modern. However, the ones from the Northeast were the national shame for the country. They were not integrated to modern life. So this caused discrimination between these two populations. So the issue of people from the Northeast explains many of the issues that the presidency of Lula causes in the country. During the elections of Bolsonaro, until now, all political manifestations from the South and Southeast, from the right wing, usually involve extreme attacks against those from the Northeast. They are called retarded. And Lula suffers from this because he was born there, and people ask themselves how we can have someone from that region governing our country. This issue is fundamental for racism in the country. This creates a big obstacle, and then people never talked about discrimination against them ever again. There isn't much we can cover when talking about the military dictatorship, but in 1978, the Unified Negro Movement is created, MNU, a national movement, that as I already said, it will emerge to criticize racial democracy. Next slide, please. One of the most renowned intellectuals founder of the Negro movement, Abdias Nascimento, he created quilombismo, which was a political Afro-Brazilian alternative. And this was inspired in quilombos in order to create economic and political projects based on a community basis. So quilombismo is creating a new way of making politics in Brazil. It has Pan-Africanist roots, but the idea was to recover that Afro-Brazilian ethos to inspire alternative political projects and even of development. And from Abdias Nascimento, the proposal of Black awareness, a National Day of Black Awareness, to replace the National Day of Slavery Abolition, because the idea is to denounce that there was no abolition of slavery that was signed by Princess Elizabeth, the daughter of Peter II. So the idea was that we haven't ended the system of slavery, and we must replace the day of slavery abolition with Black awareness. And currently, this has consolidated as a commemoration day in Brazil. History involves many Black intellectuals and scholars. We will talk about Floresta Fernandez from the project from UNESCO that we could say the Fernando Enrique Cardoso, which was he was his tutor, and it was part of a project of UNESCO. And on this topic, other authors have also written books. And now we go back to the history of Higienia. When Floresta Fernandez made this project of UNESCO, two intellectuals were part of it, Brasil Nogueira and Virginia Bicut. He made a book that explains the difference of racial issues in Brazil and the United States. And he says that in the United States, prejudices come from the origin, and in Brazil from characteristics. If in the United States it depends on the blood of your ancestors, in Brazil it is a mark difference because it depends on your physical characteristics, skin color, your hair, and that's the basis of racism and makes that comparison that's present today in the comparisons made. So a prejudice of origin and a prejudice of mark.
The other person, Virginia Vicudo, which was one of the first Black intellectuals who did her master's degree and who works based on psychology, the effects of racism and the children. She has a very interesting work. And Floresta Fernandez, in the history of UNESCO, when she's going to produce all the states, they hide completely Virginia Vicudo. I studied and I had never heard a line about Virginia Vicudo. I did my doctor's degree in the year 2000 about this thematic, and I never heard about this woman. And it turns out that Marcos Armoris wrote a book talking about the history. And Nogueira, who was white, process that he wanted the recognition of her work as part of the team of the project of the UNESCO. But Virginia, as a Black intellectual who was a woman, and she was a woman besides, obviously she was not considered and she never achieved to be recognized. She was never able to be recognized. Her work was not recognized. It wasn't copied, but it was based on this conclusion of the UNESCO. And she was the only Black intellectual woman that was part of the group. And she was the one that was completely invisibilized in the project about racism. So this shows what Guerrero Ernesto was doing regarding racism. And Guerrero Ramos, Abby Diaz, Virginia Vicudo, Clovis Moda, who are scientists, Black social scientists, are never in the academia. No one in the academia study them. So there is effort for recovery for the contributions of those intellectuals. And in one way or another, without criticism, when we see all the things that decolonials say. Some of them say that not only the Caribbean Black Marxists, but you see Guerrero Ramos, Abby Diaz, or Clovis Mora, or Ale de Gonzalez, and you see them and you say, okay, but they talked about that for a long time. They talked about intersectionality for decades, and we only know about intersectionality based on Patricia Sea. And Clovis Moro is another super important intellectual because he makes a criticism to the social thinking from Brazil. And he says, and it is a book, he says, The Injustices of Clio, which is a book that I recommend you to read. He makes a criticism even to the Black intellectuals that were guided by a thinking that was submitted to hegemonic interests. And they made what they call the sociology of the Black praxis, or a nucleus of thoughts based on the articulation between their studies about the Black rebellion and the sociology of the praxis, which is a criticism to Marxism. And the comparison between, well, it was a criticism to Marxism and to the culturalist school. But the idea that he had was how to take the Marxism to the notion of the Black praxis, of the Black experience. These are authors that had been discussing about this project for decades, a colonialist project that contaminated the academy. And we have in the next slide, we have Laudelina Campos Melo. During the 40s, during the time that I'm talking about Betulio Vargas and the Black experimental theater, Laudelina was very important because she created a society of domestic workers. She fought for the rights of the domestic workers. She was present in the National Congress. She was within the newspaper that they had from the experimental theater. There was a newspaper with a column addressed to the clarification of the rights of the Black domestic workers. There are photocopies, and it is very interesting to see the column that she wrote on these newspapers, calling women, telling them what their rights were, how to change the self-esteem of their children for them not to feel affected by the racism. She was an intellectual that represented the Black movement. There were intellectuals that were always present in this social movement. And we have Maria de Lourdes Nascimento, who was the wife of Abby Diaz de Nascimento, who also worked for the rights of the domestic workers and the psychosocial problems of prostitution and the impact of prostitution on the Black women. And here we are talking about the 40s, the 50s, and all the works that these people carried out. And the academy simply invisibilized this work. In the next slide, we have the Americanidad, Leila Gonzalez. Maybe you have heard more about her, about Lelia. She talked much more about the participation of Black women. People study a lot Leila Gonzalez and her conception of Americanity of Latin America, about the participation of the diaspora in the construction of the Latin American countries, and the difference of the Black experience of the diaspora from the Africans. What she said about the history of suffering, humiliation, exploitation, ethnocide, loss of identity, without recalling the process of resistance, creativeness, and the fight against slavery and racism. Leila Gonzalez is now in vogue, even in the United States. They talk a lot about her. But very few people say that Leila Gonzalez traveled a lot around Latin America because she wanted to know what happened in other countries. Leila Gonzalez was in Nicaragua when there was a debate of the Nicaraguan autonomy because she wanted to learn how this project was working, this project of autonomy. So even though people do not register her work, she was in the United States, by the way, and she was also in Africa. These people were circulating around the congresses, Black congresses of the Black intellectuality of the region. When we wrote this book with Carlos Agudelo from Colombia, what Carlos made for decades was to map all the congresses and all the meetings of Black people in Latin America and Africa. So he made a historical list. He did a historical map of all the meetings, international meetings, from Pan-Africanism to most recent movements, to Durban movement, what happened at the United Nations. He did a map, and in that map, you can realize that on the contrary to what we imagine, there and of the Black leaders of the Black movements in the region. By this, I stop talking about the historical part in order to talk about the end of the 80s, where we had the process of democratization of Brazil, the new constitution, and the projects of racial equality, because that is how it was created in the legislation. Do you have any questions? Because we're now going to talk about another aspect. Until 1 o'clock, okay. I cannot hear you. I was asking you if the text is in Spanish. This text is in Spanish. I have another one in Portuguese. I have it in PDF file because these books are quite expensive. You know that in PDF, you can translate it in Google very quickly. Please do not record this. But some parts can be used by making the translation. But the idea is that we have to wait for 2 years. Maybe next year, we will be able to have it translated to other languages. In this moment, I do not have the translation into Spanish, unfortunately. Professor, in the map that you talked about the historical meetings, how many agendas? My question is, were you able to identify the origin of the reparations agenda? Could you identify separate agendas, or is there one sole unified agenda? It was a common agenda? Yeah, there was a common agenda. It's quite funny to follow the historical agendas. Beginning with the United States and with a lot of influence of international organisms during the last few years, it's not possible to talk about these topics without talking about international organisms. But regarding the agendas of Pan-Africanism, or even the most focused discussion of socialist projects of integration and or most recently with Durban regarding the identities and the difference of multiculturalisms, these agendas consolidated depending on the political period. And this is a debate that I'm going to mention in 4 days. It is a very complex debate when we talk about recognition of identities and the criticism of the totalitarianism, because we only live between the tension of a project that is almost worldwide for some agendas, for national specificities. And when we see that there are many international agencies involved, many organisms involved, then these are agendas that are quite progressive and that at some time they can be convenient and they can be combined with neoliberalism without any problem. So we are always looking for a balance to understand these agendas. Likewise, regarding the presence of these Black people in these congresses, we have the whitening policies, we see the racist theories. These were universal agendas that reach our countries, and it seems like we are living national things, but they're not. Those debates or discussions we see in Colombia, Samper. I remember Samper in Colombia and in Mexico. They were the racist theoreticals. They were present in several countries of Latin America at the same time. Like the multiculturalism, which is present in several parts of the world, the multiculturalist project. So these are agendas that change with time. Even Abdias, Guerrero, Clovis Moros, these are intellectuals that discuss about the racism and the historical inheritance, but there isn't a discussion of differences, of an identity. The fight was for the integration and for other conditions without racism, because many of these intellectuals were involved with the socialist struggles, with the theology of expansion. So the idea was that the end of racism for the inclusion of the Black people in this national project. And this today, there is a demand for the recognition of the difference of the identity. There is an individual guideline that leads us to this discussion. So the debates transform themselves with time and based on the contexts. And I won't say that there's a lot of tension. We see that the new Brazilian Black intellectuality and the older intellectuality that have been there for 60 to 7 years, there we can see some differences in the foundations, in its basis. But the Brazilian Constitution of 1988 was a very important framework, and this Black intellectuality was very present. Even Leila Gonzalez was present, Abi Diaz, Leila Gonzalez, as I said before. I forgot the first name of the senator. Black politicians, Benedicta da Silva, in the process of democratization, the Black leaders that are founders of the Black movement participated directly in the writing of the new constitution. They were very present, and they were the ones who determined and created this idea of racial equality. This was always important. Maybe if there's time, we can talk about the reconstruction. 30 minutes. Excuse me, we have other questions that were made in the chat box of Zoom. There's one person who wants to know the name of the book. Could you please repeat the name of the book? Then there we have two questions. One is, what is the role that was played by Mario de Andrade and Oswald de Andrade in this Brazilian movement? And how has the fascism been confronted from the media, from the academia, and from the movement? The current fascism, the Pentecostalist fascism. The Pentecostalist fascism I'm going to answer that question in another lesson because there will be a whole discussion about evangelical people and the politicians that they have had. So I ask you for patience because if I talk about that now, I will be moving forward. So the modernist movement in Brazil regarding the construction of the Brazilian culture was also a movement that was discussed by anthropology, how this is absorbing the idea of being Brazilian, of how this is manifested in the arts and in the Brazilian culture. I couldn't talk much about that because I am not a specialist in the Brazilian modernism. I don't know if you want to talk, to read about that, but I wouldn't have a lot of information about that movement. But yeah, it did have a very strong impact, especially because we're talking exactly about the construction of Brazil from this very strong national movement in Brazil, of this idea of how to build a culture that would correspond to this Brazilian diversity, how this project of modernization of Brazil. But I can talk about other elements later. I have worked very little with this topic and not many things about this come to my mind. So those were the two questions. Are there any other questions? Could you talk a little bit more about the work of Virginia Fernandez? She was the intellectual you mentioned who talked about the effect of racism from a psychological effect for children. Could you talk a little bit further about that experience? That is incredible, and I recommend you to watch Laudelina, to read her columns or the columns of Maria de Nascimento. Well, I even have a copy of those columns. They're in Portuguese, but we can read them together. There was a strong concern for the Black person to make progress through theater, for Black people to make progress by eliminating guilt and the racism. We didn't want the Black people to believe that. So all these actions from the Black experimental theater had a very strong impact, that the Black people had to be the change, had to change himself or herself to change the structure. It was a Black person who could not incorporate the subordinated position to make progress. Of course, there is a dosage of Eurocentrism. It was the modernization of the Black people. For the Black person to adapt himself or herself and to accept the values and the concepts of the modern world. But yes, there was a concern for children to fight against the psychological incorporation of their inferiority. This was always very present, and which repercutes when the Black movement says that the most important place to fight against racism is the educational system, that is the schools. The racism only changes with education.
Racism only changes with education. You must change the textbooks that are used at schools, the way history is taught at schools, the images used on books, the photos, having visibility of Black children so they can see other people that are similar to them. That has been the fight in Brazil and has been fundamental for the Black movement. And today there's a movement. I'm not that familiar with it. I am still discovering it. But it is a very interesting movement besides the studies from Virginia Bicudo, but about the psychological effects of racism on children. But there's a number of therapies that incorporate African cultural elements directed toward the African and Black community. So this involves psychotherapy that are focused on dealing with the situation of people that face racism. For example, they say that white therapists are not able to understand the experience of racism and how one lives it. I am very curious about this. It is recent, but has been developed in Brazil. So we have psychology and pedagogy, and this is very recent. If we apply racial quotas for entering university, that's not enough if you're not changing the education that's being taught at university. It must be changed because it is focused on white leaders of history with a distorted view of slavery, with the idea of racial democracy. So it is an academia in which indigenous, because there are also quotas for indigenous students. So I think it is the most advanced country in Latin America. But you also discover that it is a country with high level of religious fundamentalism, and that is very conservative, and we didn't realize this until we had Bolsonaro. We can say that Bolsonaro had one positive thing, which is that it made Brazil see Brazilian people to see themselves. They started to denounce homophobia, sexism, misogyny, discrimination. And this project I was talking to you about was a very dark one, because when you tell people we're all Brazilian, all of your culture is a national culture. We recognize Black people, indigenous were actually isolated, but you recognize the participation, the culture, and say, okay, this is the national origin. But at the same time, in parallel, you have a series of policies and practices that consolidated day-to-day racism with migration, with the labor market, and we didn't talk about police violence from the members of the police and the security forces. I say this is contradictory because this is a country of the joyful people with harmony, but this is combined with a country that's extremely violent. Brazil is a violent country, and it has always been like that. And there seems to be a pacific closeness living between these two contradictory ideas. So Bolsonaro taught and shows the society what Brazil actually is. All the violence we see is horrible, but we also take of the mask, of the myth of the national building. So I think it is the opportunity to review history and to ask ourselves what country do we are. There's a dispute in the National Congress, which is dominated by right-wing parties. The extreme right-wing parties, we could say that the regular right-wing parties have disappeared. We never thought we would miss those right-wing parties, but today we are in the extreme side of right-wing parties. So now, since the Congress is dominated by them, public policies that are racist, that are homophobic, that they say publicly they are demanding their right to be racist. Sometimes it is claimed that Brazil it is a Christian country based on family, the values of family, and we are listening to things we thought were unthinkable. And we didn't realize those things were happening. And this is interesting to start talking about what's coming forward. And I think that's the difference between Brazil and the rest of Latin America. We are also one of the most unequal countries in the world. People ask themselves if Brazil has a middle class, has all of these cities, but the difference between the richest and the poorest in Brazil is one of the biggest in the world. So we're said to be one of the most unequal countries in the world. And it was hard for me to understand that. I lived outside Brazil, I lived abroad for many years. There are many poor countries, for example, India, which is huge. But how is it possible that Brazil is more unequal than India? And if you see, if 1% of the population has half of the richness of the whole country, and that a big part of the population lives with less than minimum wage, you see that there's a very serious issue. There's a saying that says that in Brazil you can live with the conditions of life they have in Switzerland, but you also have a different country within Brazil that has the conditions of life similar to those in Africa. So it is very hard to explain that. So that's the frame we can give. We also have a Brazil that has changed. We have a very conservative Brazil and a different Brazil that has changed a lot. We are in the middle of a war between two different proposals. Hello, when you said that the National Congress has three groups, agribusiness, evangelical religious groups, and the third one, what was it, the military power? No, they're not military members, but they defend the arms, similar to what happens in the United States. So there's a big arm industry in Brazil, weapon industry in Brazil. Yes, this also comes back to landowners and what happened in agricultural lands, the occupation of the land. And we also have organized crime in Brazil, the influence of arms, the security forces, the right to bear arms in the country, because Bolsonaro, with the Congress of extreme right-wing parties, they wanted to replicate the model in the United States with the rights to bear arms, and their people were given more freedoms to bear arms in the country. The right of landowners in rural areas to bear arms. Common is that they defend the freedom, the full right to bear arms. And we're talking about a country that's already violent. There were several referendums to ask population regarding the right to bear arms. The majority, around 70%, says they do not want it. There's no support of the population, but still within the Congress, they insist on giving people freedom to bear arms. So what Bolsonaro did was start controlling this industry. This is done along with the military in Brazil. They have control, part of control of this, and there was a lack of control of the use of arms. But this also has to do with militias and politics in Brazil. There's also an issue with organized crime, but especially with militias. We cannot talk about the government of Bolsonaro without talking about militias, especially in Rio de Janeiro. They started with former police officers that came from the military police part. This is one of the biggest issues of Brazil. This is a part of the police security forces that are in quartels, and they started to organize groups in favelas against drug traffickers, against violence, and they were forcing businesses in favelas and populations to pay taxes to them. And they started to isolate police security forces, and they started to favor militias in favelas. They were also involved with drug trafficking, and today militias, how do you call them? We could say mayors. This is how you call them here. There are also many deputies that belong to the militias. So militias are now fully involved in politics. Bolsonaro and his family are also involved with militias in Rio. And everything related to weapons is related to agribusiness or with